The chamber lights burned bright, washing the marble walls in a cold glare as cameras panned across a restless audience. Every breath seemed amplified, a collective anticipation hanging heavy in the air. At the long mahogany table, Judge Richard Posner leaned forward, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He tapped a pen against the microphone. Tap, 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 a rhythm that sliced through the silence like a dare. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, voice sharpened to a blade, "you speak of constitutional integrity as though you've studied it in depth. Yet your arguments read like the footnotes of a freshman textbook. Tell me, do you truly grasp the principles you claim to defend? Or is this all performance for the cameras?" The words landed like a slap. A murmur rippled through the audience. Reporters exchanging startled glances, aides shifting uncomfortably, viewers at home inching closer to their screens. It wasn't just a question. It was an open attempt to diminish her, to paint years of work and sacrifice as little more than a staged act. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless. Her hands rested calmly on the polished wood, her posture a quiet counterpoint to the judge's sharpened arrogance. The overhead lights caught the subtle gleam of determination in her eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The room felt suddenly smaller, the tension a live wire ready to snap. Posner pressed on, sensing momentum. "This nation is tired of grandstanding," he declared, his voice rising just enough to feed the cameras. "If you can't articulate the very foundation of the Constitution without theatrics, perhaps your seat at this table is a courtesy you haven't earned." A sharp gasp escaped from someone in the gallery. The challenge was blatant, the disrespect unmistakable. Viewers across the country would later describe the moment as a gut punch, a powerful man testing the limits of civility, daring anyone to stop him. Crockett's gaze never wavered. Behind that steady calm lived stories of late nights, relentless study, and the weight of communities that trusted her to hold the line. The chamber seemed to lean forward waiting for a tremor, a flash of anger, anything. But no one expected the quiet figure across the table to respond like this. Outside the chamber, the nation churned with unease. Headlines scrolled across screens in coffee shops and airport lounges. A presidential election months away, immigration reform stalled again. Trust in the courts at historic lows. People argued in grocery lines and subway cars about what justice even meant anymore. It wasn't just politics. It was a question of identity, of who truly belonged in the American story. That's why this hearing mattered. It wasn't a dry procedural review or a polite policy debate. It was a test of the country's core values, played out under relentless lights and broadcast to millions. The subject was the Constitution itself. Who interprets it? Who protects it? Who wields it like a shield and who bends it like wire? Judge Richard Posner, long celebrated for his sharp intellect and cutting wit, had entered the room with the confidence of someone who believed the law was his personal domain. To him, this confrontation was just another chance to assert that authority. But for Jasmine Crockett, the stakes were infinitely higher. She represented neighborhoods stitched together by immigrant families and first-generation dreamers, people who understood the promise of America because they'd fought for a seat at its table. Every skeptical glance she'd endured, every lecture about knowing her place, lived inside her like flint waiting for a spark. This moment wasn't just about defending her own knowledge of constitutional law. It was about proving that the nation's founding document belonged to every citizen, not just to those who spoke with a certain pedigree or carried a certain name. Cameras captured the contrast. Posner's practiced sneer against Crockett's quiet resolve. Commentators on live feeds whispered that the judge had already won the optics war. After all, what chance did a freshman congresswoman have against a jurist whose writings filled law libraries? But those same feeds lit up with another current.
Tweets and posts from teachers, students, and immigrants watching from living rooms and break rooms. They recognized the familiar pattern of condescension. They knew what it meant to be underestimated. The air in the chamber thickened as Posner's words settled and a deeper truth surfaced. This was bigger than a clash of egos. If he could publicly belittle an elected representative, someone chosen by voters to defend their rights, what message would that send to every ordinary citizen? That their voice too could be dismissed as freshman footnotes? That the Constitution was a closed club? Reporters sensed it. Keyboards clattered in the press rows as they framed the narrative in real time. "Democracy on trial," one headline would later read. Because in a moment when courts and Congress felt miles apart from the people they served, this hearing became a proxy battle for the nation's soul. Was America still a place where truth could rise from any street corner? Or had it become a stage reserved for those with titles and tenure? The audience inside felt it too. A staffer's pen stopped mid-scratch. A law student in the gallery tightened her grip on a notebook. Even the cameras seemed to hum louder, as if aware that the next word spoken might echo far beyond these walls. Across the table, Crockett inhaled slowly, the weight of history pressing in. Her composure wasn't silence, it was strategy. Every heartbeat counted. Every pause a declaration that she would not be rushed or rattled. Because the next exchange wouldn't just challenge a judge's arrogance, it had the power to redefine who gets to claim the Constitution and to remind a divided nation that dignity and justice still belong to the people. And somewhere deep in the charged stillness, everyone sensed it. The moment about to unfold could change the conversation forever.
He wore confidence like armor, a polished veneer forged over decades in marble courtrooms and ivy-covered lecture halls. Richard Posner's name had long been synonymous with brilliance, the prodigy who devoured legal texts before most kids finished high school novels, the jurist whose opinions could sway the direction of national policy with a single phrase. To his admirers, he was a maverick, a mind so sharp it carved its own path through precedent. To his critics, he was something else entirely, a man who believed intellect granted immunity from humility. Posner's ascent had all the trappings of legend. Born to comfortable means, he stormed through academia like a force of nature, collecting degrees and accolades as easily as other men collected ties. Professorship at a top law school? He had that before most colleagues settled into tenure. A seat on a powerful federal bench? Offered with little debate, as if destiny itself had signed the confirmation papers. He became the kind of public intellectual who filled auditoriums with students eager to catch the glint of his wit. Newspapers quoted him as if his judgments carried the weight of scripture, and for years, perhaps they did. But brilliance has a shadow. The same razor mind that cut through legal complexity also cut people. Colleagues whispered about his impatience, how he dismissed dissent with a single arched eyebrow. Clerks described the thrill and terror of working for him, how a single misplaced comma could unleash a monologue that felt like standing in a storm. He prided himself on candor, often calling it honesty, but those on the receiving end knew it by another name, cruelty dressed as truth. There were controversies, of course, high-profile cases where his opinions seemed less about the law and more about Richard Posner himself. He argued that economic efficiency should guide constitutional interpretation, sparking outrage from civil rights advocates who heard the subtext loud and clear, that rights could be measured on a balance sheet. When questioned, he brushed off critics with an eloquent wave, remarking that sentimentality is not a legal principle. The remark became a calling card for admirers and a warning for opponents. Behind closed doors, the contradictions deepened. Friends spoke of a man who could recite poetry late into the night, yet scoffed at compassion in the courtroom. He championed open dialogue, but bristled when challenged. He insisted the law must evolve with society, even as he dismissed the lived experiences of those most affected by that evolution. His supporters framed these tensions as complexity. His detractors saw only ego. Years on the bench hardened his belief that authority belonged to those willing to wield it without apology. He cultivated a public persona of detached logic, yet enjoyed the theater of provocation. Television producers discovered that a Posner interview guaranteed viral moments. A sly insult here, a verbal trap there, always delivered with that trademark half-smile that said, "I've already won." Viewers either applauded or recoiled, but no one looked away. When he stepped down from the judiciary, many expected a quiet retirement filled with books and lectures. Instead, he moved freely into the political arena, unbound by robes and precedent. Op-eds dripped with the same barbed eloquence, challenging politicians, mocking activists, occasionally contradicting positions he once defended. Some saw a restless thinker evolving with the times. Others saw a man intoxicated by his own notoriety, unwilling to surrender the spotlight. And so, when this high-stakes hearing was announced, a public confrontation over constitutional principles, no one was surprised that Richard Posner seized the opportunity. It was the perfect stage. Cameras rolling, national tension high, and audience hungry for spectacle. He entered the chamber certain of his advantage. After all, who could match decades of legal mastery, the weight of countless citations, the aura of a living legend? He believed intellect was armor, and arrogance the sword. He believed his reputation alone could silence opposition. But across the aisle sat someone forged in a different fire.
Long before the bright lights of the Capitol hearing room, Jasmine Crockett learned to steady herself against storms. She grew up in a modest Dallas neighborhood where summer heat shimmered off cracked sidewalks and neighbors treated each other like extended family. Her mother, a school teacher with an iron will, filled their small home with books and a conviction that knowledge was both shield and sword. Her father, a postal worker who never missed a shift, preached dignity in labor. "Your work is your name," he told her. Those lessons etched themselves into Jasmine's character long before she understood their full weight. As a child, she was the one who asked too many questions in class, the one who stayed after school to argue gently but firmly about why a history chapter ignored the contributions of Black and immigrant communities. Teachers alternated between admiration and exasperation. "You don't have to fix the whole world before recess," one once joked. Jasmine only smiled. Even then, she sensed that injustice didn't wait for a convenient time to be challenged. College brought both liberation and obstacles. She won a scholarship to a state university where her confidence met the quiet, constant hum of doubt from those who underestimated her. Advisors nudged her toward practical majors, suggesting law might be too competitive, too expensive, too much. But each dismissive comment only stiffened her resolve. She juggled 2 part-time jobs, library assistant by day, diner waitress by night, while mastering constitutional theory in the hours between. When her peers faltered under pressure, Jasmine seemed to grow calmer, as if adversity itself was her training ground. Law school was a crucible. She faced professors who challenged her not with curiosity, but with skepticism, questioning whether our perspective carried objective value. Rather than shrinking, she sharpened her arguments, turning every case study into an opportunity to prove that empathy and rigor could coexist. By graduation, she had earned not only top marks, but the quiet respect of those who had once doubted her. She carried that respect like a private victory, not as proof to others, but as confirmation to herself that persistence outlasts prejudice. Her early legal career took her into community defense work, courtrooms where clients arrived frightened and overlooked, where a single misstep could cost a family its home or freedom. Jasmine listened, explained, and fought. She refused to treat people as case numbers. Neighbors began to speak of her as the one who doesn't just show up, but stands up. The local press profiled her relentless advocacy for immigrant families facing deportation, for single mothers crushed by predatory landlords. Each case reinforced what she'd always believed. The law was not a trophy for the privileged, but a lifeline for the unheard.
Public service beckoned next, though it meant even harsher spotlights. Campaigning for state office, she encountered coded slights about her age, her gender, her skin. Opponents dismissed her as too passionate, as though conviction were a flaw. She answered with long days knocking on doors, listening to stories of people whose struggles mirrored her own. When she won, it wasn't with the backing of deep-pocket donors, but with the steady support of teachers, postal workers, small business owners, the very people who had raised her. Washington was another battlefield entirely. In committee hearings and late-night negotiations, she remained unflappable, blending patience with precision. Colleagues noticed how she absorbed hostility without letting it harden her. She doesn't just argue, one aide observed. She invites the truth to stand on its own. Her speeches rarely relied on theatrics. Instead, they carried the quiet power of lived experience, the resonance of someone who knew the stakes weren't abstract, but human. Through it all, Jasmine never lost sight of the communities that first placed their trust in her. Weekends often found her back home, visiting the same neighborhoods where she once walked to school with a backpack full of questions. She sat with elders on porches, listened to parents in crowded church basements, and reminded young people that their voices mattered long before the world recognized them. Her presence wasn't a photo op, it was a promise. Now, seated across from Richard Posner under the unyielding lights of a national hearing, those years of preparation gathered silently around her. Every late-night shift, every classroom challenge, every courtroom defense, they weren't separate chapters, but the same story. Each trial a lesson in patience and resolve. She knew the history of power trying to belittle those it feared. She had lived it in miniature long before facing it on this grand stage. Reporters might see only a composed congresswoman in a tailored suit, but beneath that calm lay the steel of someone who had wrestled with doubt and emerged stronger. The same child who once demanded her textbook reflect the truth now carried the hopes of countless families who believed America could be better than its skeptics allowed. Her steady breathing, her unwavering gaze were not mere performance. They were the culmination of a lifetime spent proving that dignity needs no permission to stand tall. Every lesson from her journey would soon be tested.
The first questions after Posner's opening jab were routine, procedural, yet every syllable carried an edge. Reporters hunched forward, sensing the quiet tremor beneath the surface. Posner leaned into his microphone, his voice a measured drawl at first, slicing through the room with surgical precision. "Congresswoman," he began again, "you've spoken at length about constitutional inclusivity, but where, precisely, does the text support your interpretation of open-ended rights for those who were never envisioned by the framers?" He let the words hang, eyes narrowing as though daring her to falter. Jasmine Crockett met his gaze, unhurried. "The Constitution," she replied evenly, "was written to guide a living republic. Its amendments prove that progress is not only possible, but intended." Her tone was steady, almost gentle, but the conviction behind it was unmistakable. Posner pounced. "Intended by whom? The men who feared even their own citizens?" His voice sharpened, rising a notch. "You claim evolution, but what you're advocating is invention. That is not jurisprudence, that is theater." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. A journalist's camera clicked, the sound amplified in the tense silence. Crockett folded her hands, letting the interruption settle before speaking again. "Theater," she said softly, "is when power pretends the world has not changed." The judge's brow furrowed. "Pretends? Congresswoman, you insult the very foundation you claim to protect." He interrupted before she could respond, his words tumbling faster, louder. "Do you deny that the framers limited federal power? Do you deny they distrusted the masses? Your argument is an emotional appeal dressed in constitutional garb." Viewers watching the live stream felt the shift.
Posner's voice carried the impatience of someone used to winning by volume, while Crockett's calm presence drew focus like gravity. Social media feeds lit up in real time. "He's rattled. She's ice." Crockett waited for his last word to fade. "I deny," she answered evenly, "that their caution was meant to chain every generation to their own fears. They built a system flexible enough to meet the future. We are that future." The audience stirred, a few quiet claps quickly hushed by security. Posner pressed forward, irritation cracking through his polished demeanor. "You speak of flexibility as though law were clay. What stops tomorrow's demagogue from twisting it to tyranny under your theory?" She didn't flinch. "What stops them," she said, "is exactly what we're doing here. Public scrutiny, democratic engagement, the courage to confront abuse of power in daylight." The words landed with a quiet thud of truth. Posner's jaw tightened. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice now unmistakably raised. "Courage is meaningless without discipline. You confuse activism with governance." The contrast sharpened with each exchange, his gestures wide and impatient, hers measured and deliberate. He interrupted again, but each interruption only magnified her composure. The room felt the imbalance, like a storm battering a mountain that refused to move. Reporters whispered. A young law student in the gallery scribbled frantically, noting how each spike of his voice met the unbroken rhythm of hers. Social media feeds lit up in real time. "He's rattled. She's ice." Posner tried one last push, voice nearly echoing. "Tell me then, Congresswoman, what grants you the authority to rewrite the very charter of this republic?" Silence followed, thick and electric. Crockett let it stretch until the air itself seemed to lean toward her. "The people," she said finally, her voice low but resonant. "The people grant that authority, and they've charged all of us, not just judges or scholars, with carrying the Constitution forward." For a beatheart, even the cameras seemed to still. The chamber's restless energy paused, caught between the thunder of his challenge and the quiet certainty of her reply. Posner opened his mouth, then closed it, the next argument caught somewhere between thought and pride. Around them, the audience exhaled as one. The clash was far from over, but the balance had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The storm growing louder, the mountain standing firm, a confrontation about to reach a breaking point that would echo far beyond these walls. The room seemed to shrink around them, the space between judge and congresswoman charged like a drawn bow. For a long breath, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She let the silence settle until even the faint hum of the lights felt deafening. Viewers watching across the country leaned toward their screens, caught in the stillness. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to cut glass. "Judge Posner," she began, "you've built a reputation on asking hard questions. I respect that. But questions lose their power when they ignore the answers history has already given." A subtle stir moved through the audience. Posner's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to interject, but Crockett lifted a single hand, not in defiance, but in a quiet request for patience. The gesture, small and deliberate, carried unexpected authority. "You've argued," she continued, "that the Constitution is a frozen document, locked to the fears and limitations of men who lived 2 centuries ago. Yet those same men included an amendment process, an explicit mechanism to adapt, to grow. If they intended permanence, why provide the very tool for change?" Click. A camera flash lit the chamber. "They abolished slavery through that process," she went on, each example a measured step. "They granted women the right to vote. They guaranteed equal protection under the law. Were those, in your view, emotional inventions? Or were they the framers' own invitation to future generations to perfect the union they began? Another flash, another murmur. Posner shifted slightly, the polished certainty in his posture giving way to something less defined. Crockett's gaze held steady. You worry that flexibility allows tyranny, but history tells a different story. Tyranny thrives when power goes unchecked, when a handful of voices declare themselves the sole guardians of meaning. Flexibility, in contrast, has been the very safeguard of our democracy. It is how we have corrected injustice time and again. She paused, letting the point hang, her stillness as commanding as any raised voice. I know this not as theory, she said, softer now, but from the lives of the people I represent. Immigrants who pay taxes and serve in our military. Teachers who fight to give every child a fair start. Families who trust that the law will not ignore them simply because their ancestors were not at the table in 1787. In the gallery, a young woman clasped her hands, eyes bright with recognition. My own parents taught me, Crockett continued, that the Constitution belongs to them as much to any scholar. My mother in a crowded classroom, my father on his postal route. They believed, still believe, that America's promise is not a relic, it's a living commitment. Posner leaned forward, attempting to recover ground. Congresswoman, admiration for your family aside, sentiment does not interpret law. She nodded, acknowledging the interjection without conceding an inch. Correct. Law interprets law, which is why the Supreme Court itself has affirmed again and again that our Constitution is a living document. Justice Marshall said it must be read in the light of our whole experience. Justice Brennan called it a charter of human rights capable of growth. Were those two sentimental errors? The judge's jaw tightened, his fingers tapped once against the table, an unconscious beat. Crockett pressed on, her voice gaining quiet strength. And consider this, she said. The Constitution begins not with a list of exclusions, but with 3 words, we the people. Not we the privileged, not we the property owners. We the people. That is both invitation and obligation. Every generation must define that phrase anew, or risk betraying it. A collective inhale swept the chamber. Even the reporter's keystrokes slowed. You argue that my interpretation threatens discipline, she said. But what threatens this nation more? A willingness to include every citizen in its protections, or the arrogance of believing that a single perspective can claim final authority? She let the question breathe, her eyes never leaving his. Judge Posner, you've asked where in the text my argument lives. It lives in the amendments. It lives in the jurisprudence of courts across centuries. It lives in the enduring power of we the people. It lives in the simple truth that democracy is not preserved by silence, but by participation. The people grant us the mandate to protect those ideals, and I will not apologize for honoring it. A sudden burst of camera flashes turned the chamber into a staccato storm of light. The audience erupted, not in cheers, but in a low, rising murmur of awe. Someone whispered, "That's it," barely audible, but perfectly timed with the hush that followed. Posner straightened, but the confident tilt of his chin had softened. He began to speak, halted, then tried again. "Congresswoman," she held his gaze, still composed. "I grasp the principles I claim to defend," she said, voice steady as a heartbeat, "because every citizen I serve lives them, and because this nation, at its best, demands that we continue to live them." The judge's next words caught in the air. Cameras caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face. A man accustomed to controlling the narrative, now forced to absorb it instead. Crockett leaned back slightly, the faintest glint of resolve in her eyes. "The Constitution is not yours to grant or withhold," she finished. "It belongs to all of us, and it will endure, not because we freeze it in the past, but because we carry it forward. The chamber held its breath. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, but the weight of the moment defied quick transcription. Outside, social media feeds exploded. Clips of her final lines rocketed across timelines. "It belongs to all of us." Hashtags began to trend before she'd even lowered her microphone. Hashtag "We the People." Hashtag "Crockett Clapback." Hashtag "Living Constitution." In the room itself, the silence stretched, electric and undeniable. Posner's reputation for quick retorts offered nothing now. He shifted in his seat, a subtle acknowledgement that the ground beneath him had moved. For a heartbeat longer, Crockett let the stillness speak. No gloating, no theatrics, only the quiet certainty of a point made and a principle defended. Then, with deliberate grace, she set her notes aside, signaling not victory, but closure. The crowd exhaled, a sound more felt than heard. The duel of words had ended, yet its reverberation was only beginning. And as cameras followed every motion, one truth crystallized across the nation. The clash was no longer about a single hearing or a single judge. It had become a measure of what America could still be when dignity stands unshaken before power.
Long before the chamber emptied, the outside world had already erupted. Phones across the country vibrated in unison as the first clipped videos of Jasmine Crockett's takedown streaked across social media. A single phrase, "It belongs to all of us," rocketed to the top of trending lists within minutes. By nightfall, hashtag "We the People" and hashtag "Crockett Clapback" had fused into a digital wildfire, spreading from law student group chats to celebrity timelines and neighborhood forums alike. The first wave came from everyday viewers. A nurse in Chicago tweeted, "I watched with my teenage daughter. This is what constitutional courage looks like." A delivery driver in Phoenix posted a short video of himself cheering in his truck, captioned simply, "Finally, someone said it." Immigrant families shared the clip with subtitles in Spanish, Urdu, Tagalog, and Somali, each translation carrying the same charge of inclusion. The comment sections read like a collective heartbeat, people from every corner of the country recognizing themselves in her words. Journalists scrambled to keep up. Major outlets pushed notifications. Crockett silences Posner in fiery hearing. We the People moment goes viral. Cable networks cut into primetime programming to replay the exchange, analysts framing it as more than a skirmish between a congresswoman and a retired judge. This, one anchor declared, is a referendum on who owns the Constitution. Late-night hosts wasted no time turning the moment into cultural shorthand. On the Tonight Spotlight, the monologue opened with a side-by-side photo. Posner mid-interruption, Crockett mid-reply. "Guess who had the mic and the drop?" the host quipped to roaring applause. On another network, a comedian pretended to straighten an invisible robe and muttered, "Objection sustained by Jasmine," before bowing dramatically. The clips earned millions of views before sunrise. Political analysts offered deeper takes. Progressive commentators celebrated a long-overdue check on elitism. Conservative pundits, even those inclined to defend Posner, conceded his miscalculation. He underestimated her poise, and in doing so, reminded the country that intelligence without humility is brittle, one columnist wrote. Editorial boards across the spectrum praised the clarity of Crockett's argument. The New York Sentinel headline read, "Dignity triumphs over decibels." Meanwhile, Capitol Hill buzzed with a rare kind of energy. Staffers replayed the footage in crowded hallways, some grinning, others quietly thoughtful.
Law students across the nation dissected her points line by line, professors assigning the transcript as a modern example of constitutional rhetoric. A first year at Yale Law posted, "This is why I applied. This is what law should sound like." Her classmates flooded the thread with agreements. The ripple effect reached beyond political junkies. Musicians sampled Crockett's final line into beats released on TikTok. High school debate teams used the clip as a rallying cry, remixing her words into chants before tournaments. Artists sketched her likeness superimposed with the preamble, turning profile pictures into digital murals. It wasn't mere fandom, it was identification. A swelling sense that her defense of inclusion belonged to everyone watching. Posner, long accustomed to controlling the narrative, found himself at the eye of a storm he could not redirect. His carefully crafted public statements the next morning, measured, technical, faintly dismissive, were drowned out by the echo of her words. Interviews he gave to sympathetic outlets only reinforced the perception of a man clinging to a past moment of authority. Commentators noted the irony. A career built on commanding attention, now overshadowed by a single, unshakable rebuttal. For Crockett, the surge of attention arrived like a wave, but never knocked her off balance. She issued a brief statement thanking viewers for their support and redirecting praise toward the communities that shaped her. "This isn't about me," she wrote. "It's about the people who believe our Constitution must keep its promise to everyone." Her humility only amplified the admiration. Donors flooded her re-election campaign with small contributions. Community groups invited her to speak not just about law, but about belonging. Parents told their children, "Watch this. This is what leadership looks like." By the weekend, the confrontation had taken on a life larger than politics. Newspapers abroad carried headlines translating "We the People" into their own languages, framing it as a universal declaration of democratic resilience. Editorial cartoons showed Crockett standing firm while a crumbling pedestal marked "Old Guard" toppled beside her. In living rooms from Detroit to El Paso, the hearing became a touchstone for kitchen table conversations about power and inclusion. Teachers played the video in civics classes, sparking debates about constitutional interpretation. Grandparents told grandchildren about earlier fights for civil rights, drawing a line from past to present. The story had moved beyond a single clash. It became proof that dignity spoken aloud can still shake the halls of power. And through it all, that final image endured. A calm figure lowering her microphone as the chamber held its breath. A reminder that authority is not measured in volume, but in resolve. Across the country, people replayed that quiet ending, sensing that something larger than a soundbite had been born, a conviction that the Constitution, alive and expansive, truly belongs to all of us.
The moment that sparked a nationwide conversation began with a single clash of words and ended with a quiet microphone lowering to the table. Richard Posner came armed with reputation and volume. Jasmine Crockett answered with history, clarity, and the calm authority of someone who knows the Constitution belongs to everyone. That exchange, now replayed millions of times, was more than a viral headline. It was proof that dignity can disarm arrogance, and that truth delivered with composure can still command a room. If this story fired you up, don't let it stop at the screen. Share it with friends, family, and anyone who's ever wondered whether facts and patience can still win the day. Add your voice to the conversation. Post it. Talk about it. Remind people that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It's a shared responsibility. And if you want to keep standing with truth, subscribe to this channel. Every week we shine a light on the moments that show justice at work, courage in action, and ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. Your engagement, your comments, your shares, your presence helps these stories travel farther than any headline ever could. Because the lesson of this night doesn't belong to one politician or one hearing. It belongs to all of us who believe that the promise of we the people is alive and worth defending. When we stand together, when we amplify voices of integrity and refuse to be drowned out by noise, we prove that democracy is stronger than cynicism. So hit that subscribe button, share this story, and carry its message forward. Dignity over arrogance, facts over fury, truth over fear. The Constitution is ours, every word, every right, every possibility. Let's make sure the whole world remembers it.
The hearing room pulsed with a restless hum, a low vibration of murmurs and camera shutters that felt almost alive. Bright lights from a thicket of press lenses cast hard edges on every face, turning sweat into glitter and impatience into shadow. At the witness table sat Kash Patel, shoulders squared like a boxer before the bell. His grin was sharp enough to slice through the silence he clearly wanted to own. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady. She didn't fidget, she didn't blink. The air between them carried the weight of two entirely different worlds, one cloaked in bravado, the other armored in quiet conviction. Patel tilted his head, a sneer curling as he launched another jab, his voice laced with mockery that barely masked a simmer of frustration. "Is this really the best you've got?" he taunted, each syllable meant to draw blood. Gasps rippled through the audience benches. A journalist's pen scratched furiously. A flashbulb popped like distant lightning. The committee chair rapped the gavel, but the tension refused to break. Crockett didn't flinch. She simply breathed in, the calm of someone who had weathered storms far more dangerous than a grandstanding operative. Her silence stretched, an invisible rope pulling the room tighter, tighter still. Patel shifted, an almost imperceptible flicker of doubt crossing his face. The crowd sensed it and leaned forward as one. Somewhere in the back, a phone began to record in earnest, its red light blinking like a warning. Then, Jasmine spoke, not with volume, but with precision. Her words came measured, deliberate, every consonant striking like a gavel of its own. The first sentence drew a startled intake of breath from the gallery. The second made Patel's smirk falter. And then, 5 words that froze the room. The effect was immediate. A sharp, electric silence replaced the restless buzz. Cameras captured Patel's eyes widening, the tiny collapse of a man who'd underestimated the power of composure. The crowd's collective heartbeat seemed audible, a single held breath before eruption. But how did we reach this boiling point? The answer traces back further than anyone expected.